Jake had always been fascinated by space. As a young scientist, his dream was to explore the unknown, to communicate with life beyond Earth. It was late at night in his small lab, the only light coming from the glowing screens of his experiments. His latest project involved testing a new device that, he hoped, could establish contact with alien life. He wasn't sure if it would work, but tonight, he was determined to find out. He pressed a few buttons, staring intently at the screen. The machine hummed to life, its lights flickering, casting strange shadows around the room. Jake felt a rush of excitement. He had never been this close to something big. Then, without warning, the air in the room began to shimmer. His eyes widened in disbelief as he watched the space in front of him warp and bend like a mirage. He stepped back, heart racing. Before he could even react, a figure appeared before him. She was tall and graceful, with long flowing hair that shimmered in the dim light. She wore an outfit that looked both ancient and futuristic, made of materials Jake didn't recognize. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught Jake off guard. It was her coconuts that immediately stood out. They were not just big. They were enormous. Jake's face turned bright red as he quickly averted his eyes, his mind racing. The alien girl looked just as startled as he was. Her eyes were wide, her face flushed with an unmistakable blush. She seemed to be just as confused about what had happened. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice soft and melodic, but also full of surprise. Jake blinked, unable to form words at first. I don't know. You just appeared," he stammered, his heart still pounding in his chest. His mind was spinning. Was this real? Was he dreaming? This couldn't be happening. The girl looked around, taking in her surroundings. It didn't take long for her to realize something wasn't right. Her hands instinctively moved to cover her chest, as if trying to hide what had happened, but it was no use. Her coconuts were too big now. She blushed even deeper, and Jake couldn't help but feel embarrassed for her. What is this? What did you do to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake, still shocked, tried to explain. "I didn't mean to. I was just testing this device. I thought it could communicate with aliens, but..." His voice trailed off. "I didn't expect this." The girl seemed to calm down a little, though she still looked unsure of what to do. She glanced at Jake, then at her surroundings again, as if trying to understand what had happened to her. "I'm Lyra," she finally said. "I'm from a distant galaxy. I didn't mean to come here, but your device, it pulled me in. And now this." She gestured to her enlarged body, clearly uncomfortable. Jake took a deep breath, trying to regain some control over the situation. I didn't mean to do this to you, Lyra. I swear. I just wanted to make contact. I never thought it would change you like this." Lyra shook her head, still confused. She took another step back, her hands moving nervously. "I don't understand. Why is this happening? And what am I supposed to do now?" Jake's mind raced, but there was no clear solution in sight. He had created a mess, and now he had no idea how to fix it. The only thing he knew was that Lyra was real. This wasn't some hallucination or dream. This was happening, and he had no choice but to help her. He stepped forward, wanting to reassure her. "I'll figure it out. I'll fix it. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way." Lyra hesitated, still clutching her chest. She looked at Jake with a mixture of disbelief and trust. "You will? How?" Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to think of a solution. "I don't know yet, but maybe I can reverse the machine's effect. I've been working on some formulas that might help. We'll figure it out together." Lyra nodded slowly, though she still looked uncertain. "All right, but I don't know how much time we have. If I stay like this, I might cause more problems." Jake's heart sank. He hadn't thought about the consequences, but Lyra was right. The longer this lasted, the bigger the mess could become. He had to act quickly. As he hurried to his desk to gather his notes, Lyra stood there, still blushing, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But there was something about her that seemed strong. She wasn't giving up, even though this was all so strange and frightening. Jake knew he had to do everything he could to help her. But the clock was ticking, and he had no idea what would happen if he couldn't fix this soon. Every second felt like a lifetime. Would Lyra's coconuts continue to grow? Would they be stuck like this forever? Or could he somehow reverse it before it was too late? The tension in the air was thick, and Jake knew that everything was about to change. Forever. You said, as he stared at the machine, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe there was something he hadn't considered. The key wasn't just in the machine. It might be in Lyra herself. There had to be something about her biology that could help reverse what had happened. But how could he figure that out without making things worse? He turned back to Lyra. I'm not giving up. I'll find a way to fix this. Just hang in there. I know this is terrifying, but I promise I won't stop until I've made it right. Lyra didn't say anything, but her expression softened. It was clear that she still wasn't sure about the outcome, but Jake's words seemed to offer her some comfort, even if only a little. Jake's mind raced as he stared at the machine, his fingers hovering over the controls. He had been working for hours, trying to reverse the effects of the accident, but nothing seemed to be working. Each attempt he made only seemed to make things worse. Lyra's coconuts were still growing, and her discomfort was clear. She had been patient with him, but Jake could tell she was starting to lose hope. The embarrassment on her face had faded into something else. Fear. Fear of what was happening to her, and perhaps fear of what might happen next. I don't understand, Jake, Lyra said, her voice soft but filled with concern. I thought you could fix this, but nothing you're doing is working. Jake rubbed his forehead, frustration creeping into his mind. I don't know what else to do, Lyra. This wasn't supposed to happen. I thought I could control it. But the machine, I don't even know what it did to you. She lowered her head, her long hair falling over her face, covering her eyes. You don't understand. My people, we have certain rules, certain changes that happen to us. But they're not supposed to happen like this. If this continues, I don't know what I'll become. Jake's heart sank. He hadn't even considered the possibility that Lyra's species might be affected differently by the device, that her body would react in ways he couldn't predict. She wasn't just a victim of his mistake. She was now trapped in it, and there was no clear way out. He had to figure out how to undo the damage. But what if the damage was too great? What if there was no going back? Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. What if this is permanent? What if I never go back to the way I was? Jake's stomach twisted. He couldn't bear the thought of that. He had to help her. He couldn't let her suffer because of his mistake. He took a deep breath and turned back to the machine, trying to gather his thoughts. We need to understand what caused this. There has to be a reason why the device reacted the way it did. Maybe there's something in the data that can explain what went wrong. Lyra watched him carefully, still standing awkwardly in the corner of the room. I don't know if there's time for that, she said quietly. Every second that passes, I feel different. Like my body is changing in ways I don't understand. If we don't fix this soon, I don't know what will happen. Jake could hear the panic in her voice. It was hard to ignore. He had to do something, and he had to do it now. I won't let this happen, Lyra. I promise. I'll figure it out. He began scrolling through the data on the screen, his eyes scanning for anything that could help him understand the situation. Every adjustment he made seemed to have no effect. The numbers didn't match anything he'd expected, and nothing seemed to connect. He felt like he was looking at a puzzle with no pieces that fit. Then, suddenly, something caught his eye. A small line of code, hidden deep in the data. It wasn't something he had programmed, and it wasn't part of the standard test. It looked like an error, something that shouldn't have been there. Jake leaned in closer, squinting at the screen. Could this be it? Could this be the key to fixing everything? What is it? Lyra asked, her voice full of hope. Jake's fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to isolate the error. I don't know, but I think I found something. It's a glitch in the system. Something the machine picked up when it connected with your energy field. I don't know why it's there, but if I can remove it, maybe that will stop the changes. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide with interest. You think it will work? I don't know, Jake admitted, but it's the only lead I've got. With a sense of urgency, Jake began to manipulate the code, carefully pulling out the glitch he had found. Every second felt like an eternity. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but he had no choice. If he didn't try, Lyra's transformation might continue, and he might never be able to fix it. The machine hummed louder as Jake made the final adjustments. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he thought all hope was lost, Lyra's body suddenly flinched. She gasped, looking down at herself. The growth in her coconuts seemed to slow, and she let out a sigh of relief. It's working, she whispered, a smile forming on her lips. I can feel it. The changes are stopping. Jake's heart raced with excitement. He hadn't fixed everything, but at least he had made some progress. The tension in the room eased slightly, but Jake knew there was still more work to do. He couldn't stop now. I think we're on the right track, Jake said, looking at Lyra. But we're not done yet. We need to keep going until we're sure everything is back to normal. Lyra nodded, still breathing heavily. Thank you, Jake. You're my only hope. Jake smiled, trying to stay calm. We'll get through this, together. But even as he said the words, he knew that this was just the beginning. There were still so many unknowns, so many questions left unanswered. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. One wrong move, and it could all go wrong again. The race to save Lyra had just begun. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the screen, a mix of hope and uncertainty swirling inside him. Lyra's body had stopped changing, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The glitch he had isolated seemed to slow the process, but it hadn't completely reversed the effects. Her coconuts were still slightly enlarged, and the tension between them was palpable. Jake knew he couldn't relax until he had fully fixed the problem. Lyra stood across the room, still looking uncomfortable. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and anxiety. She had trusted him, and he couldn't let her down now. Okay, Jake said, his voice steady despite the rising pressure. We've made progress, but we still have work to do. We can't stop yet. Lyra nodded but seemed hesitant. I'm still not sure, Jake. I feel like I'm not really myself anymore. I don't know how to explain it, but something inside me feels different, like I'm not in control. Jake could hear the unease in her voice, and it made his heart ache. She wasn't just dealing with the physical changes. She was dealing with something much deeper, an internal transformation she couldn't control. He couldn't imagine what she was going through, but he had to fix this for her sake. I understand, Lyra, Jake said softly, but I need you to trust me a little longer. I'm not giving up. We'll fix this together. She looked at him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she gave a small nod, the tiniest glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. Okay, I trust you. Just don't let it go too far. I don't know how much more I can take. Jake turned back to the machine, his mind working through the next steps. He had to find the exact root of the problem. The glitch had slowed the transformation, but now they needed to reverse it completely. The machine was still picking up signals from her body, signals that didn't belong. If he could recalibrate it further, maybe they could stop the changes entirely. He worked quickly, inputting new data, adjusting the settings, trying to figure out what had triggered the transformation in the first place. But no matter how hard he tried, the machine wasn't responding the way it should. The data was still erratic, and the signals seemed to get stronger with every attempt. Lyra's voice broke the silence. Jake, I'm starting to feel weird again. It's happening faster this time. Jake spun around in alarm, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected this. The machine should have been stopping the process, not speeding it up. He rushed over to her, his mind scrambling to figure out what was going wrong. "Lyra, hold on. Don't move, okay? Let me fix this," Jake said, trying to sound calm, but his voice betrayed the panic that was growing inside him. But Lyra's eyes were wide with fear, her breathing becoming more shallow. "Jake, I don't know if you can. It's getting harder to breathe. The changes, they're too much for me to handle." Jake's stomach churned as he watched her struggle. He had to do something, and fast. The time for careful adjustments was over. If he didn't stop this soon, Lyra might be stuck in a state of constant transformation. Her body could be irreparably damaged. He couldn't let that happen. Without thinking, Jake yanked at the wires of the machine, trying to disconnect it from the mainframe. His hands shook as he worked frantically, pulling out cables and pressing buttons with desperation. He had to do something, anything, to stop the transformation from escalating. Then something clicked. He looked down at a small readout on the screen, a section of the code that he hadn't noticed before. It was buried under layers of data, and for some reason, it hadn't registered in his earlier attempts. The machine had been emitting a frequency that was amplifying the transformation, not stopping it. The signals weren't just from Lyra's body. They were from the machine itself. "I found it," Jake shouted, his eyes wide with realization. "It's not just you, Lyra." The machine's frequency was feeding into the process, causing the changes to get worse. "I need to neutralize the signal." Lyra looked at him with a mix of fear and hope. "Can you really fix it? Can you stop it for good?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He was already working, adjusting the controls, adjusting the frequency, rerouting power to the machine's core. Sweat was dripping down his face, his mind spinning with calculations and quick decisions. He couldn't waste a single second. This was it, the last chance to reverse what had happened. The room seemed to vibrate as the machine powered up once again. The humming noise grew louder, the lights flashing more intensely. Jake held his breath, watching the screen as the frequency stabilized. Slowly, the changes in Lyra's body began to slow. Her coconuts stopped growing, and her breathing began to steady. "Is it working?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling with hope. Jake exhaled slowly, his heart still racing. He kept his eyes on her, watching for any signs of change. "I think so. The process has slowed down, but I need to make sure this doesn't start up again." For a few moments, nothing happened. The air was still, and the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Lyra's body seemed to be settling back to normal. Jake's pulse was steadying, but the fear still lingered. He couldn't rest until he was sure. Finally, Lyra took a deep breath, her hands falling to her sides. She looked down at her body, her expression shifting to one of relief. It's stopping. It's really stopping." Jake let out a long sigh, his shoulders sagging with the weight of everything he had just gone through. He had done it. He had saved her. "I knew you could do it," Lyra whispered, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Thank you, Jake. You've saved me." Jake smiled back, though exhaustion weighed on him. "We did it together, Lyra. I'm just glad you're all right." But even as he spoke those words, Jake knew that this wasn't over. The device had worked, just barely, but there were still so many unknowns. They had only just begun to understand what had happened. Would the machine still be dangerous? Would they be able to control it in the future? The answers were out there, and Jake was determined to find them. But for now, they had survived, and that was enough. Jake sat back against the lab table, his body aching with exhaustion. The weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy in the air, but for now, Lyra was safe. She was back to normal, her body no longer changing, no longer threatening to spiral out of control. But the relief was only temporary. He knew there was still much to figure out. Lyra was standing across from him, her body visibly calm, though her eyes betrayed a deep worry. She had always been strong, but this experience had shaken her. "Jake," she said softly, her voice quieter than before. "How did this happen? What went wrong?" Jake rubbed his eyes, trying to gather his thoughts. He had never expected to find himself in a situation like this, one where everything he had worked for had led to a terrifying mistake. But now that they had a moment of peace, it was time to reflect. "I don't really know," he admitted, looking at her. "The machine, it was designed to make contact with alien life, but I didn't account for the kind of energy fields your species has. Something in the device's frequency triggered an uncontrolled reaction in you. It shouldn't have happened, but once it did, I had no idea how to stop it." Lyra nodded, absorbing his words, though her expression didn't change. "It wasn't just the physical changes, Jake. I was scared. I felt like I was losing control of my own body. Like I wasn't the same person anymore." Jake's heart tightened as he heard the fear in her voice. He had been so focused on fixing the physical effects of the machine that he hadn't fully considered the emotional toll it had taken on her. "I'm so sorry, Lyra," he said, his voice full of guilt. "I never meant for any of that to happen. I thought I could control it, but when things got out of hand, I didn't know how to fix it." Lyra stepped closer, her eyes softening. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me, Jake. You were trying to help. But now we need to figure out what happens next. If the machine caused this once, what's to stop it from happening again?" Jake stood up, his thoughts racing. She was right. Even though they had managed to stop the transformation, the machine was still a wild card. There was no guarantee that the same thing wouldn't happen again if he didn't fix the underlying problem. "I'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice firm. "I can't let this happen again. I need to understand how the machine interacts with your biology. I need to know how to control it, how to make it safe." Lyra gave him a small smile, though it didn't completely erase the worry in her eyes. "I trust you, Jake. Just don't make any more mistakes." "I won't," he promised, though he couldn't help but wonder if he could really keep that promise. The machine was untested, and the unknowns were endless. But one thing was certain, he had to try. For Lyra, for the future. Jake turned to the machine, staring at it as if it were both the key to their salvation and the source of their problems. It had brought them together, but it had also nearly destroyed everything. The machine had to be fixed, but fixing it wasn't going to be easy. He didn't know what kind of research he would need or what kind of changes he would have to make to ensure the machine wouldn't harm Lyra or anyone else again. But Jake was determined. This wasn't just about science anymore. It was about protecting someone he cared about, someone he had grown to understand and respect in ways he hadn't expected. Lyra's voice broke his thoughts. "Jake, I know you're thinking about the machine, but do you think we could ever have normal lives again?" Jake looked at her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her question. She had just been through so much, and yet here she was, asking about normalcy. What could he say to that? Could they ever go back to a life before the machine? Before the accident? Before the changes? He took a deep breath and walked toward her, reaching out to gently take her hand. "I don't know if we can go back to the way things were, Lyra. But I do know this. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. And we'll figure it out, step by step." Lyra gave him a small, relieved smile, and for the first time in hours, there was a sense of peace between them. They still had a long road ahead, but they would walk it side by side. And that, for now, was enough. Jake turned back to the machine, his mind focused. There was no time to waste. He had a lot of work ahead of him. But now, at least he had a clearer sense of direction. One thing was certain. He would never stop trying to make things right. For Lyra, and for himself. Jake's mind was still racing as he sat at the control panel, watching the flickering lights of the machine. He had thought that the worst was over, but he knew better now. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges, and more questions than answers. Lyra's safety was his top priority, but so much was unknown. "Jake, do you think we've really solved it?" Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood by the door, watching him, still uncertain and wary of the machine that had caused so much trouble. Jake rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the exhaustion clouding his thoughts. "I don't know, Lyra. The machine still has so many unknowns. I think we've stopped the changes for now. But there's no telling what could happen next. It's like we've only scratched the surface." Lyra walked over, her footsteps light, but her presence heavy with the weight of the situation. "I don't know how much longer I can stay like this, Jake. I'm still not completely sure I can trust this machine, or you, for that matter. I don't know what it's doing to me." Jake looked up at her, his eyes filled with concern and regret. He understood her fear, but the guilt gnawed at him. He had put her in this situation, and he couldn't just stop now. Not after everything they had gone through. "Lyra, I get it. I do. I've made mistakes, and I can't take that back. But I'm not going to stop trying to fix this. You don't have to trust the machine, but you can trust me." There was a long pause, the tension in the room thickening. Lyra looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the seams of her clothes, as if trying to ground herself in something familiar. She let out a breath, finally meeting his gaze. "I trust you, Jake. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I trust you. And that's more than I can say for this machine." Jake nodded solemnly, grateful for her words. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. He knew that trust was the foundation they needed to build on. Without it, they couldn't move forward. "We'll figure it out, Lyra," Jake said, standing up and walking toward the machine. "I promise. We'll make this right." He began to enter new codes into the machine's interface, more carefully than before. Every adjustment, every change he made felt more critical than ever. He had already messed up once, and he couldn't afford to make another mistake. He had to ensure that the machine wouldn't do any more damage. As Jake worked, Lyra stepped closer, her eyes studying him intently. "Jake, how much do you really know about this machine? I mean, do you even know what kind of effects it could have on me, or anyone else?" Jake hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys. It was a question he had asked himself countless times since the incident. The truth was, he didn't know enough. There was so much about the technology he was working with that he didn't fully understand. It had been experimental when he started, a way to learn more about alien species and their biology. But now it had become a ticking time bomb. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice strained. "That's the problem. I don't know everything, but I'm learning. Every second we're together, I'm learning more about how this works, how your species reacts to it. I'll find a way to make it safe. I'll fix it." Lyra's gaze softened, but she still seemed uncertain. "You keep saying that, but how can we really know it's safe? How can we be sure that it won't start up again, that the changes won't come back stronger next time?" Jake didn't have an answer. He couldn't promise her that everything would be fine. He couldn't guarantee that the machine wouldn't cause more harm. All he could do was keep trying, keep working until he had a solution. "I can't promise that it'll be completely safe yet," Jake said slowly, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I can promise you that I'm not giving up. I'll fix this, even if it takes everything I have." Lyra looked at him for a moment longer, searching his face for something. Perhaps reassurance, perhaps a sign that he wasn't just grasping at straws. Finally, she nodded. "I believe you. But we don't have much time, Jake. What if the changes come back before you figure it out?" Jake's heart skipped a beat at her words. It was a fear he had been trying to avoid, but now that she had voiced it, it felt all too real. If the changes returned, if they couldn't stop them, there was no telling what would happen to Lyra, or to anyone who came into contact with the machine. He had to find a solution, and fast. "I'll speed up the process," Jake said, determination in his voice. "We're not waiting around for another disaster to happen. I'll make sure this is fixed, once and for all. As he worked, the machine whirred to life, its screen flashing with more data than Jake could process in a single glance. He tried to keep up with the numbers, but it felt like a maze of unknown variables and coded messages, each one more cryptic than the last. His eyes darted from one line to the next, and every error message seemed like a dead end. Lyra stood behind him, watching in silence, though Jake could feel her gaze on him, heavy with expectation. He couldn't afford to disappoint her again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the machine's screen flickered, and a new message appeared. Frequency stabilization complete. Jake's pulse quickened as he read the words. Was this it? Had he finally fixed the issue? He turned to Lyra, his expression tense. I think I've done it, but I'm not sure. I need you to stand by me, Lyra. This is the final test. Lyra swallowed, clearly nervous, but she nodded, her face determined. I'm with you, Jake. Let's do this. With a deep breath, Jake pressed the final command, holding his breath as the machine hummed in anticipation. It was out of his hands now. They had done everything they could. Now, it was time to see if the machine was truly safe, or if it would spiral out of control once again. The next few moments felt like an eternity. The hum of the machine was deafening as Jake waited for any sign of change. His fingers gripped the console, his heart hammering in his chest. It was the moment of truth. Lyra stood by his side, her eyes wide with anticipation and fear, but there was nothing either of them could do now. The machine was running on its own, and they were at its mercy. Jake watched the readout closely. The numbers were shifting, fluctuating, but they weren't as erratic as before. There was no sign of a dangerous spike, no warning lights flashing red. His breath caught in his throat. Could it really be working? For a long minute, nothing happened. The machine's frequency seemed stable, the energy pulses even and rhythmic, a steady hum that filled the room but didn't rattle the walls like before. Lyra shifted uncomfortably beside him. Jake, is it over? Can we finally relax? Her voice was shaky, uncertain, but there was a hint of hope in it. She wanted to believe it was done, that the nightmare was over. I don't know yet, Jake muttered, his eyes still glued to the screen. It's not showing any immediate signs of danger, but I can't be sure just yet. We need to wait a little longer. Another moment passed. Still nothing. The data on the screen continued to stabilize, the fluctuations gradually tapering off. The readings were almost normal now, like they should have been from the start. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at Lyra. She was holding her breath, her face tense. He could see the hope in her eyes, but he knew that she, like him, was afraid of what might happen next. If the changes were truly gone, they'd both have to trust that the machine was functioning as it should, and that nothing would go wrong again. Suddenly, Lyra let out a breath she didn't even know she'd been holding. Jake looked over at her, his stomach tightening. She had been so brave, but this was all so much to process, so much to endure. Her eyes met his, and in them, Jake saw the mix of emotions she was trying to hold back: relief, fear, gratitude, and a lingering doubt. I think it's stopping, Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded slowly, his throat tight. The readings on the screen had leveled out, no longer jumping or fluctuating wildly. The machine wasn't causing any more changes. He cautiously took a step back from the console and turned to face her. I think it is, too, Jake said softly, still trying to process everything that had happened. But we're not out of the woods yet. We need to stay alert. Lyra nodded, still unsure but looking more at ease than she had before. She took a few tentative steps toward him, her gaze softening. What now, Jake? What happens to us now? Jake met her gaze, the weight of everything they had been through settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure if there was a simple answer. There was so much left to figure out. The machine, Lyra's body, the consequences of the experiment. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We move forward, Jake said, though his voice held uncertainty. "We find out exactly what this machine is capable of. I need to make sure it's safe, and we need to figure out what all of this means. For you, for me, for everything." Lyra stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. There was a quiet comfort in her touch, a reassurance that they weren't facing this alone anymore. "Together, right?" she said, her voice steady but full of quiet resolve. "No matter what happens next, we face it together." Jake smiled, feeling his own uncertainty begin to ebb away. The fear, the confusion. They were still there, but they weren't as overwhelming anymore. They had made it through the worst of it, and that had to count for something. "Together," Jake repeated, his voice firm. "We figure it out together." Lyra's smile was small but genuine, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt the faintest flicker of hope. They didn't know what the future held, but at least they had each other. As they stood together, the machine hummed one final time, its lights slowly dimming. The world felt a little quieter now, as if it was holding its breath along with them. They had survived the chaos, but there was still so much left to learn, so much to uncover. They had taken the first step, and that was all they could do, for now. But Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until they had answers. He wasn't going to stop until Lyra was safe. They had already come this far. They could go even further. Together.